Welcome to episode 45 of Published. Today I'll speak with Justin Branch, the Director of Consulting here at Greenleaf Book Group. We'll be talking about navigating publishing options today and how he helps as authors figure out which publisher is the right fit for their book.
Welcome to Published, a podcast by Greenleaf Book Group, where we'll discuss the ins and outs of the publishing industry, from writing a book and finding the right publisher to gearing up for a book launch. And now, here's your host, Greenleaf Book Group CEO, Tanya Hall.
Welcome back to Published. In this episode, we'll explore the wide range of publishing choices available to authors and how to navigate through them to land on the publisher that's right for you. Drawing on his lengthy publishing experience, Justin will also touch on how to sniff out publishing scams and the biggest mistakes he's seen authors make when evaluating publishers. He also offers insight on how to protect your work and ensure that you're exploring every avenue when it comes to publishing your book. Let's get into the interview. All right, Justin, welcome to Published.
Thank you so much. Great to be here talking to you about this today.
Yeah, happy to have you. And for our audience's pleasure, Justin and I have been working alongside each other for almost 17 years now.
Yes, indeed.
It's remarkable. So, Justin, why don't you start by telling the listeners a bit about your background and what you do?
Sure, yeah. So I'm the Director of Consulting for Greenleaf. And what that means is essentially my role is to help identify books and authors that we feel have promise and then develop the right strategies to get them from where they are to where they want to be. And I had kind of an unconventional journey to get here. Like you, I also went to film school originally at the University of Texas. And the day after graduation, went out to Southern California where I worked in television. In a variety of capacities, from production with King World Productions and Hollywood Broadcasting to marketing with Cox Communications. And then just over 16 years ago, I met the leadership at Greenleaf Book Group and was just blown away by the vision they had and where they saw opportunities in an industry that had been kind of stuck in place for quite some time. And I immediately connected with the idea of helping authors get their ideas out there, competing with the major houses without having to sacrifice as much as they had had to sacrifice in the past. And like I said, for 16 years, I've been enjoying it. And one of my favorite parts is getting to spend time with authors every day and helping them realize their vision for their book.
Yeah, it's interesting. We both come from television backgrounds. And I think the deeper you get into your career, the more you see the parallels across all media in terms of really an oversupply of content and an underdemand of eyeballs, as we say.
Absolutely. Yeah, and getting the pieces, and that even gets down to kind of some of the big challenges that we'll get into of how do you connect a great message with an audience that's just being bombarded with messages right now.
Mm-hmm, definitely. So can you cover the main routes that an author has for publishing in today's market?
Sure. So there's three primary routes. The first one is traditional publishing. So that's what you typically think of when you think of like Random House or Simon & Schuster. And the next one is self-publishing. So with that, you're kind of your own general contractor. So you're finding designers and editors and distributors and marketers. And finally, there's hybrid publishing, which kind of takes really the best of some of those worlds and puts them under one roof. And the reality is that each of those models have some really strong upsides, and each of them have some downsides. And I think that as we think about the pros and cons of each, you kind of have to look and say, okay, what are they bringing to the table, and what are you giving up in exchange for that? With traditional publishing, what they're bringing to the table is expertise, right? So they've been doing this for 100 years. They have incredible resources when it comes to design and editorial and that sort of thing to really help support a book. The challenge with that, and this will get into some of the bigger complaints people have about it, is you're giving up ownership, you're giving up control. You're giving up a lot to pick up their expertise. With self-publishing, you're kind of your own general contractor. So you're going to have to find your own designers, your own editors, and all of that. And What's nice about that is that you have ownership and you have control. You're going to put out the product that will be exactly what you want it to be. And you'll have the ability to own all of that IP. But the challenge is it's very hard. There's a learning curve to publishing, and it's very hard to put together a book that can truly compete with what Random House is doing and what they have been doing for a very long time. When you're doing it for the first time. And because there is so much competition in the market, you can do 99 things perfectly for a book, but one misstep, you could lose an audience with that. And that's one of the challenges with the self-publishing route, is really putting together a product that can compete. Hybrid takes the best of both of those worlds as far as the ownership and the quality and the control and all of that. But you're investing in your project. So you're paying for things like cover design, editing, printing, and so on. So you're investing in the book, but you're getting the upsides that were typically reserved for the publisher before that.
Yeah, well said. And you mentioned some of the issues with each model, and that each, I don't even know that they're issues, but pros and cons, I suppose, about each model. And what are some of the bigger complaints that you hear when you talk to, I know you talk to a lot of authors about exploring a fit. So what are some of the bigger complaints that you hear for these authors who are searching for a publisher?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the model that they're looking at. With traditional publishing, typically lack of control is a big one. It's often not the cover that you choose. It's the one that they've selected for you, for example. It may not be the editorial direction that you would have had, but they felt it was in their best interest. So when you're working in a traditional model, they're buying the rights from you. It's their book, and they're going to do what they feel is in the best interest of the book. Naturally, it's their book from a retail perspective. And that may be out of alignment with what your goals are for the book. So when you don't have that control, you may produce a book that is, while it's appropriate for retail, it may not accomplish your goals for the book beyond retail because it was out of alignment with your platform and your brand and your messaging. Lack of ownership is another big complaint. At one time, not too long ago, what you would do with an idea is you'd put it on thin paper and you'd put it between thicker paper, and that was a book, and that's kind of the end of the journey for the idea. But now there's so many ways to repurpose and reuse content, from putting together workbooks based on the content, or we've done custom editions before where you have a big main client and they want to, you want to do a branded version for them. They're going to buy 3,000 copies of the book. The CEO will write a forward and redo the cover to match the brand colors, color palette of the brand for the company, and do a custom one. When you don't own it, you can't do that. Online learning modules. I mean, there's just so many derivative products that exist now that didn't before. And it's not to say that if you go traditional, you can't do those things, but there's a lot more steps in the way. You may not be able to do those things, but there's certainly going to be a lot more barriers in the way. So that ownership question has become more relevant than ever before. The other complaint I typically hear, or two of the other complaints I hear, one is lack of marketing. Sometimes it can feel like when a book is out, it's a bit of a lottery ticket, and the publisher is throwing out as many as they can get, or buying as many lottery tickets as possible, hoping a few winners will pay for a number of misses. And the only way for that business model to work is to invest as little as possible in each book, and that way a few good hits can pay for a lot of misses. That's obviously can be very frustrating as an author when the publisher is investing very little in the success of your book, and this is your book. Maybe you're going to write several, maybe this is the one, but you do want to make sure that it's been given every opportunity to find success. So a few other things to kind of look out for, or just be aware of rather, is that with a traditional model, there may be things like a buyback clause where they're basically saying, okay, we'll give you an advance right now, but at some point over this period of time, you need to buy several thousand copies of your book from us at X cover price. So the challenge there is obviously you're saying, okay, I commit to giving you, the publisher, basically buying $30,000 worth of inventory from you down the road, but you're still surrendering all of your control and all of your ownership. And that can obviously be quite frustrating. The other thing that pops up is things like a first right of refusal, and this gets into contract questions. But sometimes when you're signing a deal for your first book, you are putting future titles through a process where that publisher may get first right of refusal for it. And if you weren't really pleased with your experience on the first book, that's just another hoop that you'll have to jump through to navigate it through to the right publisher on the second one. Timelines is another common concern. It takes time to do things right, but if you need to go find an agent and then you wait for the agent to go shop it around, and then you negotiate the deal and get the deal, and then you go through the production process and the distribution process, it can take a while to get out there. So those are kind of some of the big complaints you hear. On the self-publishing side, it's typically quality is the biggest challenge. And the reason that matters now is that it's never been a better time to be an author. And that's because you have more options than ever before. The pinch points have been removed. It's much easier for you to get directly to your audience. And the flip side of that is that because of that, the market has just been flooded with books. So cutting through the noise is one of the biggest challenges. And when you're self-publishing, it can become very difficult to cut through that noise because from a production standpoint, let's just take cover design, for example. Everyone judges a book by its cover, despite what our mothers taught us. And a great cover needs to fit in and stand out at the same time. It needs to fit the look of the genre and the feel. But it also needs to stand out to get attention. And a lot of that information, that insight, is information inside the publishers have, but self-publishers don't. So therefore, it can be very difficult to create a product that can truly compete. And continuity is another challenge that you face on the self-publishing side. When you have a lot of different vendors getting everybody marching on the same page. With hybrid publishing, one of the biggest challenges is the investment in it. It's not cheap to do these things well. And an author needs to be in a position financially to where they see the value in doing it with a hybrid publisher for it to make sense.
And I will add, sometimes people come to me and they say, well, I'm worried about going with a traditional publisher because I don't want them to rewrite my book. And I tell them, let's not get carried away. They're not going to pay you for the privilege of rewriting your book. It's not that extreme. But yes, they may make some changes, certainly, to make it more marketable. So what advice would you give to authors who have their heart set on a single publisher? We've both met people who have stars in their eyes and they've got it on their bucket list to have their book published by so-and-so. What would you tell that person?
Sure, you bet. So the value of an imprint, of the publisher, the little logo that goes on the spine of the book, has changed a lot over the years because there's just so many publishers out there. And most readers don't look at that. So if I ask you, what is the last Simon & Schuster book you read? I don't know. And we're in the industry. It's often author-driven and marketing-driven and packaging-driven far more than publishing imprint-driven. So the first thing is to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what is the real value of this particular publisher? The next thing you want to think about is, okay, what is important to me as an author? So what are my goals for this book? Why did I write this book? What do I hope to accomplish with this book? And then which publisher is best positioned to get me to my goals? So I've always found that books are most successful when they can serve as both a product and a tool. And this can be true for fiction and for nonfiction. So as a product, it needs to be a great standalone product. It needs to be well packaged, well positioned, of course, well edited, distributed properly, and marketed aggressively to have a shot to compete in mainstream retail. So from a product standpoint, it needs to fulfill those things to get your message in front of people. But often the higher value of a book is in the opportunities it creates for you and the doors that it opens for you. So what kind of opportunities can this book drive? So what kind of higher margin items can this book drive if it's nonfiction? So do you want it to help drive your speaking business? Do you want it to raise your profile as a thought leader, to help drive your core business in the other things that you're doing? Do you want it to help drive up your speaking rate? Depending on what you do and what your industry is, I would start to think about, okay, how can this book really help me? Because often, if you can convert a $8 book royalty into a $25,000 engagement, the value of the book and even the way you think about the investment in the book changes dramatically. So be thinking about what you want the book to open. And if it's fiction, of course, there's things like film rights, there's foreign rights, there's paperback rights, there's audio rights. There's a lot of other ways to further monetize fiction as well. So once you're clear on what your goals are for the book as both a product and potentially as a tool, start to evaluate publishers using that. When you're looking at traditional publishers, how do they align with your goals? Which of your goals do they align with? Even just if they ask you about your goals for the book beyond it, it just shows that that is of interest to them, and they want to make sure that helping you be successful on a number of fronts is in a shared interest with everyone. Again, look at the ownership and the control and look at what they're bringing to the table and what they're asking for in return and see if that aligns with what's important to you. Look at their titles. So look at their books. So on all of them will have websites. Take a look at their books and see, okay, do I connect with the way they're packaging and they're positioning their books? Do I think this would work for my books? Now, every book's going to look completely different, so you don't necessarily want to look at it and say, would that cover work for my book? Of course not. The cover that the publisher designs for your book will be perfect for your book and for your audience. But looking at their title list as a whole, do I feel that the way they package books, do I feel it will attract an audience? Look at how on the back end they're going to promote the book. That's going to be really important for you. Often, especially in the traditional world, that burden is placed on the author. So again, what are you getting and what are you giving up in exchange for it? And as you start to do that, you may arrive at the place where you started and say, yes, that is the perfect publisher for me. And if that's the case, go for it. Again, that's one of the beautiful things about being an author right now is that you have a lot of options and go for the ones that are most important to you. If it doesn't fit, then you want to start to open up the aperture and look at other options from there. But I would always say have a backup option in your pocket. When you pick a publisher, it's going to be your partner for a very long time. Writing a book is a huge commitment. And once a book is out there, it's out there. You want to make sure that it's done well out of the gate.
And speaking of picking a publisher, we both know there are, of course, unfortunately, some bad players in the business. And how can an author sniff out a credible publisher versus maybe someone who isn't?
Yeah, that's unfortunately the downside of having so many options right now is that not all of them are good options. So think about it. In the publisher for one book, what's perfect for one book may be very different than what's perfect for another book. If the book is a book that you wrote for family and friends, then trying to find a publisher that does a big retail push may or may not make sense for you. If it's a book that's going to be, in a lot of ways, the centerpiece of your brand and your thought leadership, then having a very credible publisher is going to be incredibly important for you. So I would always start with Google searches because it's the easiest way to start. I mean, people talk, the release of a book is such an important thing to an author. They've put so much of themselves into it that if a publisher isn't serving them well, typically they'll let people know about it. So it's pretty easy to find publishers that have a strong reputation online and publishers that don't. So I would always start with that. Again, once you select your publisher, it's very difficult to make a book go away. So if you pick the wrong publisher and it's released in a way that you're not pleased with, it's not as easy as taking it down and getting out of your contract with them. Sometimes the contract doesn't allow that. Sometimes when the book's on Amazon, you can't actually make it go away. It'll show out of stock, but Amazon will still show that it existed. And kind of stumbling out of the gate can make it much more difficult for a proper launch to take place down the road. I'd look for a publisher that has a vested interest in your retail success. So when you are working with a publisher that is primarily making their money on the front end, meaning selling you publishing services like design and editing and all of that, but they have no vested interest in you being successful on the back end with retail sales, their objective is to get your approval, right? They want you to say, yes, I like this, I approve this, then they can move on with whatever it is that they're doing next. When a publisher has a vested interest in your book being successful in retail, they have a higher obligation. They still want you to love it, of course. They want you to be excited about it, but they also want to create a product that has the potential to be successful in retail. And while you never know exactly how a book's going to perform, there are things that really help move the needle. And a good partner should be one that looks and says, okay, what are the things that matter and what are the things that move the needle? And how do I make sure each one of those things are best in class? So not only do I end up with a product that serves you well from a product standpoint and as a tool, but also create a product that will serve all of us well in retail and give us the best shot of success.
And for authors who are concerned about intellectual property theft or plagiarism, how do those people protect themselves as they're seeking this publisher fit?
Yeah. Again, online research is always a good first point. If you see some red flags out there, follow your gut. Chances are it's not a place that you want to be. Talk to them and get a feel for the quality of work they do and the comfort level you have. You should be able to talk to someone there, and they should be knowledgeable and informed and give you kind of an initial feeling as to how far you want to explore things with that publisher. You can always ask for an NDA. If there's any reluctance to offer an NDA, that might be a bit of a red flag as well. And at the end of the day, trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, there's just too much that you've put into this as an author to take a chance on it getting tied up into issues like that out of the gate.
Right. And what are your thoughts on publishers who, quote unquote, guarantee the author a specific result, like hitting a bestsellers list or a certain number of copies sold?
Sure, yeah. I would be extremely skeptical. Again, there's a lot of things that you can control when you're releasing a book, and you want to make sure that the things you can control are best in class. But there's always going to be things that are outside of your control that are also going to impact how successful a book is in retail. And when you hear kind of the idea of guaranteeing a bestseller list, there's a number of bestseller lists. So the big ones that we look at in the industry are things like New York Times, Wall Street Journal bestseller list. And hitting these lists typically require sales of between 5,000 and 15,000 books in a single week. And these are not sales into retailers. These are sell through to customers. So it's very difficult for a publisher to predict that 15,000 people are going to go buy your book in retail, especially for a debut author. If you're a first-time author, if your last 3 books hit New York Times, well, chances are things are looking very optimistic for you. But it's hard for a publisher to guarantee how many people are going to go to your bookstore in a 1-week period and buy the book. We've been fortunate at Greenleaf, of course, to have a bunch of New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestsellers over the years. But again, a lot of it is making sure that all the things that you can control are done well. And then a lot of it comes down to things like author's platform, their ability to, and everyone's ability to organize that platform and get those customers into retail. Another thing you can sometimes hear is like the Amazon bestseller list, which that is a rotating list. It changes, I believe it's hourly. So you can get 3 people to buy your book at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, and chances are for a very brief period of time in your category, you're going to be an Amazon bestseller. And there is some value to that, but it's not there's no real secret sauce to it. I just gave it away. Have some friends buy a book at 3 a.m, and that should get you there.
Those are your real friends.
Exactly.
Staying up late to buy a book. Well, this has been super helpful, Justin. Thank you very much for joining us. And any parting advice for our listeners?
Sure, yeah. So writing a book is a huge commitment. And once it's out there, and it's really difficult, like I was saying before, to make it disappear. So make sure you spend your time, you put a lot of time into the writing process. So make sure you spend enough time making sure that you're finding the right partner on the front end to give it the best shot at success.
Great advice. Justin, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
That's it for our episode today with Justin. We hope you enjoyed learning about what to look for when evaluating a publisher. For notes and resources from today's show, go to greenleafbookgroup.com/episode 45. You can also find advice for writing, publishing, and promoting your work in my book, Ideas, Influence, and Income, which you can learn more about at ideasinfluenceandincome.com. If you've enjoyed our show, please rate and review us on iTunes. It means a lot to have your feedback and certainly helps us make sure we're answering your publishing questions. A big thank you to Eleanor Fishborn, who produces the Published podcast, and we'll be back next month with another new episode.
Thanks for listening to Published. To learn more, please visit greenleafbookgroup.com. And remember to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes.